All right, Mike, before we really get into the topic, talk to me. I want to know what you learned spending the whole week in Orlando. You went to the Realtor convention in Orlando. I asked you this yesterday. You've had another 12 hours to think about it. What's your answer, Michael?
I actually did not learn a lot, and let me explain. I was not able to go up there till late Tuesday, and most of the educational sessions were Monday and Tuesday. So most of my meetings were committee meetings, which is a lot of minutia stuff. They were important, but not the kind of info that most agents would want. They would want the educational sessions. Now, attending that conference, you automatically get a copy of all the educational sessions. You get a link that you can click on to view all the educational sessions. So anyone that did attend will have the opportunity to look at that any classes that they have interest in.
That's cool. What would you say the overall sentiment in the conference was? People excited to be there, or what my boss used to say, where are all the closings? Mike, did you bring home a bunch of closings?
I think the reality is that we're all going through the same thing. I mean, the slowdown in the real estate market is not a West Coast issue. It's an East Coast issue. It's a Northern Florida issue. It's all over the state. Um, there is a little bit of optimism that maybe the interest rates will drive lower and that could loosen up things. And there also, frankly, a lot of us are optimistic that so far in hurricane season, it's been a mild year. Now, we all know that that can change quick. And we all remember last year when we had three hurricanes go up the west coast of Florida. I doubt we'll have three of them again this year go up the west coast. So this year probably will be a better year for sales just because we're not going to have that downtime that we had last year.
Yeah, I agree. There were a couple of articles out recently, if anyone was paying attention, that talked about the high termination rate throughout the state of Florida. Now, luckily, Southwest Florida is not at the top of the list. I think we saw significant termination rates in Miami, Jacksonville, Tampa, and Orlando. And some of the things that they pointed to, and so the reality is termination rates normally are around 10%. And we're starting to see in some markets, it's double that. We're looking at 20%, 25% in some areas. So that, there's something going on. The articles that I read talk about understanding that, some of the demographic shifts that have occurred. So we saw a huge influx of people coming into the market about 5 years ago during COVID, and maybe some of that is leveling out. We're also still reeling from the effects of insurance, high interest rate, inflation, and really from what the articles didn't point to, but I think of when we think of Southwest Florida, is this is a very transitional area. People come here and they leave. Mike, you and I are unique. How long have you lived in Southwest Florida now?
Wow. I probably would say 36 years and seeing a lot of changes. One other thing I wanted to point out, Christian, there was a lot of optimism up there with respect to what's happening in the insurance market in Florida. The optimism is based on, yeah, what, a year and a half ago, give or take, the legislators cut back on the attorney fees that could be earned on these hurricane claims.
Yeah.
And so we've had, I believe, at least 15 new insurance companies come into the state, and two or three of them came in recently. Now, think about that. We had three big hurricanes come through the state last year, and we still have insurance companies wanting to write policies down here. That's a major breakthrough. So we all feel our premiums are too high, but the reality is they're not increasing at the same rate they were several years ago.
Yeah, there might be a downside to that too. I mean, insurance companies know a good deal when they see it, right? So I'm going to give some people advice. Having insurance rates come down, that's a good thing. It's definitely a good thing. And having options is a good thing. But be picky about what insurance carrier you choose because the last thing you want is an insurance carrier who's straddling the line of solvency. And, even if the state is backing up that insurance company, because that's how the state of Florida works, the state of Florida will back it up if it were to fail. But you don't want your insurance company to fail. You want them to pay claims. You want them to pay legitimate claims. And you don't want your neighbor who has an illegitimate claim to kind of drive up your rate. So optimistically, this should drive competition, which should lower prices. But pessimistically, you want to make sure you're dealing with the right kind of insurance company. Dad, we've had family at Liberty Mutual forever, and that's a
Yeah.
good insurance company. They've been around forever.
Yeah.
They're not going anywhere. They underwrite correctly, they pay correctly. But there are certain insurance companies that aren't quite like that.
I absolutely agree.
All right,
Yeah,
so
the other
yeah,
thing, Christian, is the citizens' policyholders have been cut almost in half from where they used to be. So
yeah.
that's less exposure for the other policyholders around the state if we ever had, a horrific hurricane come through. So I mean, I think that's good news also. So there are a lot of things happening in the insurance industry that I think are helpful to us. And yeah, I think the governor's plan is the more insurance companies that come into the state, the more competition there is, and hopefully that helps on the premiums. Now, keep in mind, and a little bit of advice here, just because you find one company with a much lower premium, make sure you understand the coverages
Yeah.
because they might be lower because they've cut back on the coverages that they're covering. You got to really read through that policy.
I'm glad you brought that up. Before we move on to the main topic, let's talk about how I evaluate insurance policies. So number one, if you have a mortgage, you're going to need potentially three policies or three coverages. Your hazard policy, which is the traditional homeowner's insurance, that'll cover you from fires inside the house, a flood from a leaky toilet, someone slipping and falling inside the home or something being stolen. So that's your hazard policy. And then you have your wind policy. That's unique to this area. That's to cover external storms like hurricanes. A standard hazard policy, say if you were in Georgia or in the Northeast, you're not going to have that wind coverage unless you got it separately. So that's what we require here in Southwest Florida, the wind policy. And then you have the third one, which is your flood policy. It's underwritten by the federal government and FEMA. And that's only if you are in a flood zone and your home is, below the mandated elevation. So those are the three policies you need if you are owning a home with a mortgage here in Florida. But there are a lot of people that don't have a mortgage in our area. I think, typically we're looking at 60, maybe even 70% of our closings are cash. So in that scenario, a buyer might have the ability to think about insurance differently. So one way of doing it is saying, I'll self-insure. Dad, you've done that math before. You look at what's a typical hurricane damage going to look like?
Yeah.
What is the policy amount? What does it take to get money back? What is that? Your break-even period you're thinking?
Well, we this was probably 2012 when the rates first went way up for us. I think it was like $30,000 for an annual premium for everything, and there was a $50,000 deductible. So I took that into account. You take into account the exclusions, which for us was the screen enclosure. So at that time, if we had got a flood in the house, or wind damage, I'm counting my premium that I paid, 30,000, my deductible, another 50. And if it costs, you getting this insurance to save $120,000.
Right.
So, we've lived in this
When
up.
you're underwriting your risk, and
Yes,
the only reason you're able to do that is because you didn't have a mortgage.
you don't have a mortgage, right?
But then there's another way to think about it. There's kind of like this middle ground where, remember, you have three policies to consider: flood, wind, and hazard. So you say, okay, the flood doesn't really give me a lot of coverage. If the house were to get flooded, it would look like this. Here's what I would do. Maybe you
Yeah,
do the same for the wind. Maybe you're like, all right, I've
right.
been in this home for 20 years. We've never had this problem before. So you're doing a statistical analysis. But the hazard policy, maybe that's still
We
valuable.
have the hazard. We
Yeah,
just don't have
so
the wind and flood.
the hazard's really an interesting thing. A lot of people will do this where they'll get just the hazard. Typically, depends on the value of the home, obviously, but you're looking at anywhere from 2 or 3 grand up to maybe 6 or 7, depending on the cost of the home and what
Sure.
you're covering for. That could be a really good option when you're looking at, all right, I don't want to spend 30 on a policy for all three, but I will spend 4 on a hazard policy or 6 and, take that risk. You might also do it because you're renting the home or you have a lot of valuables or, maybe it's older appliances and you're like, "Oh, I just can't take that risk." So, and you might even have like a diminishing deductible. And so you think, all right, maybe that makes more
Yeah.
sense.
I know a lot of people who do that. I mean, and they take the savings like we did and put it back into the house. We use those savings to put in impact glass and get a whole house generator. So it's, rather than give it to the insurance company, we made the home safer.
Yeah, and then once you have a safer home, you can start reevaluating the insurance policy again. You can say, okay, instead of it being a $30,000 wind policy, maybe it's only 8,000 because we have the new roof and we have the new windows. So
Right.
always reevaluating, thinking about it. Rita asked a good question. Do you recommend a flood insurance policy even if you're not in a flood zone? I think it depends, Rita. So generally, the way flood policies work is the federal government first establishes your base flood elevation, BFE, base flood elevation. And that depends on a million different factors, but the government decides, all right, that's our number where we think anyone under that has a high risk of flood, and anyone over it has a low risk of flood. And that's, you can go right on to the FEMA website and get that information. What is your base flood elevation? So if you're a lender, their policies are, we want you to have a flood policy as long as you are less than 1 foot above the base flood elevation. So if you're less than a foot above it, so let's say it's 10 feet is our base. If you're not at 11 or higher, then I want you to get a flood policy. And that's what your lender is going to require. So now we have the option at this point. Let's say you're at 12. So base flood is 10. Our home is at 12. You have a very low risk of flood. Should you get a flood policy? Well, number one is cost. What is the cost?
Hmm.
Two is what's your risk tolerance? What would it cost you if you had an issue, if there was a flood? Or another thing is how likely is it for that base flood elevation to change? So if it were to go to 11, you still may not need a flood policy, but now you're starting to get a little closer. Or if, let's say it went to 12 over the next 10 years, now you're like, all right, well, now I probably need a flood policy. So one benefit of having a flood policy right now, depending on cost, is that it locks in your price. So federal government kind of has a grandfathering effect where if you have the flood policy, it can only go up so much every year. It's grandfathered in. There's a cap. So if you get a really low price, let's say it's $800 because you have a low risk, but you're also worried that the flood risk will increase, lock in the price now, lock it in. Also, if you're going to sell the home. So Mike, here's a scenario. Let's say you're planning on selling your home at some point in the next 3 years. You don't have a flood policy currently, but you're like, all right, maybe I should. Maybe, once you win the game, quit, right? Take a little bit risk off the table. One of the benefits is if you do sell the home, your buyer can assume that policy. So if a buyer were to get a new policy on a sale, number one, they have a new price. They have to pay the top dollar price. And number two, there's a 30-day wait period. So even if you close September 3rd, that buyer's flood policy will not take effect until October 3rd. There's a 30-day wait period. But if the seller has a policy and the buyer assumes it, then there's no wait. And going into hurricane season, that's a win. That's definitely the way to go. So, Rita, it's a long answer, but you're just evaluating your risk and your tolerance and making a decision. And then the other thing is you can always change your mind. That's the other cool thing. You can always change your mind. So hopefully that's helpful. All right, let's learn about FAR-BAR. So this question came up because recently, we're all trying to make deals happen. It's a tough market sometimes, and so we find ourselves going outside of our comfort zone a little bit. And recently, I've had several conversations with realtors who are saying, "Hey, my buyer is pulling me into Sarasota. My buyer is pulling me into Newport Richey, and they use FAR-BAR or they use FAR. How do I do this? What do I do?" And here's the thing. In Naples, we are used to using the NABOR, and despite my objections, most people are still using the standard NABOR contract. So you're going to assume that the best thing for you is to use a standard FAR-BAR contract in these other areas. Let's do it. Let's look at it. Let's look at a standard FAR-BAR contract and let's fill it out. Let's just make sure we make sense of it. Dad,
Lots of luck.
you have any initial thoughts on FAR-BAR standard contract? Give me one.
It is tough.
It's tough. All right, what's your main reason for it being tough? Just that it's different?
Well, the finance clause is just god awful. If you don't do anything, certain things happen after the expiration of the loan approval period, and it can make the realtor look like a real non-professional and expose the realtor to potential liability, not to mention your buyer. And then you have the whole inspection process, coupling paragraphs 9 and 12. You got to understand the three categories. General repair items does not include mold and radon, which most people miss.
Yeah.
What those one and a half things mean and how do they work? What rate should you put in there, depending if you're the seller or the buyer?
Let's look at it. Let's look at it. All right, so this is your standard FAR-BAR contract. I will say the first thing, start on page 1. Sounds pretty simple, but start on page 1.
Yeah, you're missing the washer and dryer there.
Page 1 is going to look a lot like the NABOR contract. So you should start to get a little confidence right to start. You're going to have your legal description. You're going to have where the property is located. Personal property. Dad, you hit it.
The washer dryer.
Washer dryer is not included unless you put it. So right here, we're going to put washer and dryer. Anything that would be excluded here. Now I'm going to take a second to give you some language. I had to give this to an agent last night. More and more, I'm seeing people use very simple language for personal property that's being included in a contract. I want you to realize that the gold standard is an inventory list. That's the gold standard that will protect you and your customer more than anything else, because you're going to say, all right, here's what we agreed to, and it's all in there. But for whatever reason, you can't do that. The seller refuses, the buyer doesn't want it. They just want something simple, all the furniture. I want you to go a little further than that. I want you to say all personal property, including but not limited to furniture, decorations, electronics, kitchen accessories and utensils, bed and bath linens, and just put as much as you can think of. If you want to put TVs specifically, put TVs. As seen on blank. So, or you could say turnkey furnished, including but not limited to, and put it all in there. Spend a few extra minutes putting, one or two sentences together. Throw it right here on lines 21 and 22. I would do the same on a NABOR contract, no matter what form I'm using. And then if the seller refuses, because a lot of times the buyer is making this offer, not knowing how the seller is going to respond, the seller can just put any exclusions in 24 and 25, or they can provide inventory lists. That would be great. So take a minute or two, add a little bit more information to your personal property. We did a closing yesterday where there was a painting that was included. It was an expensive painting. You got to put that on there. And then the TVs come up over and over again. Despite the fact that they cost $400 at Costco, people really want the TV.
Christian?
All right, so now, yeah, go ahead.
Two things. One, I'd say, yeah, if I'm representing the buyer, take lots of photos because we've had a lot of situations with people swapping things out. So
Yeah.
if you have, plus it helps show the condition of the property when the contract's signed. So that'll kick in the seller's responsibility to maintain the property. And the second thing is if there's a mortgage, you can't have all this stuff. You got to go a different route.
Yeah, if there's a mortgage, we're gonna have to do a separate agreement. We basically have parallel contracts. So you'd have your FAR bar contract signed, no mention of personal property, and then separately we would do a personal property contract listing out everything that's transferring. And you can reach out to us. We'll happily help you draft something like that. All right, so back to your first page. Now we're jumping right into it. You've got your purchase price. You've got your first deposit. The second difference, I guess, is you're going to put the escrow agent right there on the first page on NABORDS down near the signatures. Now, escrow agent does not mean the same thing as the closing agent. So if the buyer only knows of their person, put them on there, put Ross Title. We'll help you out. And if the seller is paying for title, they may choose someone else to do the closing, but this is where you'd put who you're making your escrow deposit to. Got your additional deposit, and then you'd put your loan amount. Then you might have seller financing potentially, and then your cash to close at that last part. Now, Dad, I'm curious, or maybe I'll put this to Mike. Mike, you awake over there?
I'm awake.
All right. I want to know your opinion on putting an offer deadline. So there's a section on the contract, time for acceptance of offer and counteroffers. When you make an offer, or what do you see? Do you put a deadline or do you just leave it blank?
Well, my thoughts are this. If you leave it blank, you leave everyone in limbo, which I don't kind of like. But if you want a real quick answer, sometimes that works against you. So because sometimes they can't find the seller. The seller's traveling or whatever. So I think you have to be realistic on the period of time for a response, but I don't like it too far one way or too far the other way. I think it should be reasonable.
So it's a very practical, reasonable answer that I think most agents would agree to. I'm gonna zag. You zigged, I'm gonna zag here. I don't use this. I leave it blank. And there are two reasons. Number one, it makes more work for me. So if I put a date in there and like you said, we can't find the seller or whatever, someone's going to call me and say, hey, can you update the time of acceptance? I don't want to do that. That's, no. I'm going to leave it blank. And if the seller signs it, great. Maybe if the buyer wants it to put a deadline, I'll put it in an email. So I'll have the buyer sign this contract. And then in my email, I say, we would like to have an answer no later than tomorrow night. But the contract doesn't need to say that. The buyer can always rescind their offer. They can always reverse. They send a quick email saying, we rescind our offer. We wish you luck. And that would be the same as having a deadline on your time of acceptance. Now, alternatively, the next question I tend to get, and the reason I don't want to do this, is if the seller wants to accept our offer, but we're past the deadline, they're going to call me again. They're going to say, oh, your offer expired. What do we do? Just sign it and send it back to me, and I'll have my buyer initial. So at that point, the seller is making the offer. So Dad, correct me if I'm wrong here. Buyer makes an offer, it expires. So that offer is no longer available to the seller. So by the seller signing that expired offer, now the seller is making an offer.
Yeah, I mean, it's just he's using the buyer's form to do his own offer, essentially.
Right. So now the seller is using the buyer's form to make their own offer. And to make a valid contract, the buyer would initial or sign the offer that the seller sent. So it's a little confusing generally, but it has to be sent and then received and sent back. So both buyer and seller have to agree to that deal. So I guess my main point is if you leave it blank, it probably saves you a step. And you can still put it in your email that you expect a response. I expect also most people won't agree with me, and that's fine. If you want to put a deadline because you think it creates urgency and that maybe the seller will jump on it real quick, great. A lot of people do it that way. I've found no deadline tends to work for my personality. All right, let's keep going. Next one, closing date,
Can
extensions.
I point out one thing, Chris?
No.
Yes, line 38. Look at line 38. That's a massive difference with Nabor.
All deposits paid or agreed to be paid are collectively referred to as the deposit. Yeah, and it's actually even more relevant when we get to the remedies clause.
Yeah,
So what you're pointing out, Dad, is that the deposit is all amounts paid or agreed to be
agreed to
paid.
be
So
paid.
the seller could potentially go after the buyer for all deposits, whether they were made or not. Whereas Nabor, it's only deposits made. But FARBAR goes even further. And when we get to the remedies clause, we'll talk about that as well. We're going to keep going. All right, number 7, section 7. This is the next thing that's a little different than Nabor. Should the contract be assignable or not? I would say that 99 out of 100 times you're going to click may assign but not be released from liability under this contract.
That's most contracts I see.
That's the most common. It just makes sense. The buyer might want to put it into an LLC or a trust, or maybe they want to add their daughter onto title. This one makes the most sense. And then if, depending on circumstances, maybe you just say no. I can't imagine why you would say no, but maybe you do. Dad, you mentioned the financing clause. You're right. This is quite different than Nabor. The cash deal is no different. So if it's a
Right.
cash deal, that's easy enough. If it is a mortgage, be careful. So, Dad, as you explained, the mortgage contingency is a use it or lose it contingency, whereas Nabor, it just keeps going. So the Nabor contingency, you have to actively waive it in order to lose it. But in FARBAR, if you miss the deadline, then you can't use your contingency anymore. It's a use it or lose it. It's a big difference. Now, if you're doing cash, don't worry about it. It's fine, and we'll skip by that. But Dad, you and I, we've done entire videos and articles on the financing contingency. It's tough. It's a tough one.
Well, and with this thing too, I mean, you're giving the seller the right to terminate for 3 days after the approval period. So, if they have another buyer in the wings, or if this buyer number one has been a pain in the rear end, the seller has an opportunity to terminate the contract. But I really hate these contracts where doing nothing creates a legal obligation, to close cash, and then the realtor somehow or another has to explain it to the buyer from some other state.
Yeah, financing contingencies, you should take a pause. The buyer should review it with you. They should call the attorney and ask questions. They should talk to the lender and make sure that the lender realizes what you're signing up for. There's a lot there. There's a lot there. Now, the good thing, the thing that I like is that when you're talking about doing an assumption of an existing mortgage, it actually gives you the advice of see rider D for term. So that means you've got to attach rider D to your contract. And then separately for the seller financing, use rider C for that one. So it's going to push you. If you're using purchase money note mortgage to seller, which is seller financing, use the other rider. I like that. I like the little hand holding. All right. You're already noticing some subtle differences, but up until this point, I'm not that scared. Really not that worried for you. I think you can make quick work of this until we get here. Man, this is so different than Nabor. And it might be I'm probably going to get in a little hot water for saying this. It might be one of the reasons why NABOR exists. Because NABOR is so different from how FARBAR's inspection clause works, it's pretty wild. All right, so this is the standard FARBAR contract. Here's the important part. Line 143. Seller shall pay the following amounts or percentages of the purchase price for the following costs and expenses. Dad, what does the word shall mean?
Absolutely have to. You can't say no.
Mandatory, yeah. So, NABOR, the seller can say no to a buyer election. And the worst that could happen is the buyer can terminate and get their deposit back. In FARBAR, the seller can't say no. That's so different. And it gets a little worse. Now, maybe this is a little bit of YouTube Hollywood magic here, but it gets worse.
It's cumulative.
So we talk about up to 1.5% for general repair items, 1.5% for wood destroying organism treatment, and 1.5% for permits. Sounds good, maybe. Maybe you like this. Maybe up until this point, you're thinking, I don't know what he's so upset about. This seems like a good option. Wait for it. Just wait for it. All right, so big picture, what this is saying is if you do your inspection, all you have to do is notify the seller of these issues, and they have to fix them, mandatory, up to that limit, minimum. At the minimum, they would have to go to that limit. So we're talking about $1.5 million deal, and that means there's a 1.5% or $15,000 limit on general repair items. So that would be
$1 million deal.
What are some examples of a general repair item, Dad?
New roof.
Oh, perfect. All right, so new roof or a patched roof, maybe. I don't know if you get a new roof for 15, but maybe you would. Let's see, a broken toilet, a leaky window.
Yeah, the utilities just aren't working.
Utilities aren't working. The water heater is broken. Compare that to NABOR, where the seller has to say yes, and then you're like, oh man, no one told me it wasn't a working water heater. In this one, the seller would just have to fix it up to that limit. So if you found a water heater, a dishwasher, a microwave, and the window needs to be replaced, you'd be well within your 1.5% limit. And you're pretty happy. You're thinking, all right, this is going in my favor as a buyer, and it's kind of going in your favor as the realtor because you look great. The deal is already negotiated. The seller has to fix it. We're moving in the right direction. Same thing with wood destroying organism treatments or permitting. Permitting is interesting. You simply, hey, we found an open permit. You got to go close it. There's no waiting for a seller response. Now, it changes, right? So it starts to change. Let's keep going. We'll go to the
Christian, can I ask one question?
No.
If you're the buyer, what would you put in the wood destroying organisms?
Well, yeah, so this was the one section that if you explain how it works, Dad, if you the seller can say no or say yes and keep the buyer in the deal.
If you do lowball numbers, it's $1 million deal.
All right, so we'll put $500 in there.
If you put $500, the seller does not have the right and the bill comes in and it's like a 10 grand to tent the house. Okay.
Yeah.
The seller does not have the right to pay the excess without the consent of the buyer. The buyer can get out of the deal on wood destroying organisms.
Wood destroying organisms, I put in the wrong. So what's interesting on the general repair items, the seller can go above
pay
that.
The excess.
So let's do that hypothetical. On a general repair item, we had 1.5%, or we'll just put real numbers in here, 15,000.
Right.
And you discovered that the roof needs a complete replacement, and it's going to cost you $50,000.
Right.
So 50,000 is way over the $15,000 limit.
Right.
So in that scenario, what do you do, Dad? The buyer tells the seller, and
well,
then
they submit the reports. They show the estimate of 15,000, and the seller has the option of saying, "I'll pay the excess."
Or if they pay the excess, the buyer is locked in, right?
Still locked in.
Yeah. Okay. And if they refuse to pay the excess, the buyer can terminate.
Buyer can terminate.
All right. Now we compare that to, we found termites. And there's
Right.
$500 here. The termite remediation is 10,000. The seller doesn't have the right to go above the excess or go through the excess,
Yeah,
right?
they can offer, but the buyer can say, no, thank you, we're terminating.
Exactly. Big difference. So appreciate you stopping me there, Dad. It is a very relevant distinction.
Oh,
It might be another little red flag that this is hard. This part is difficult if you're not very familiar with FAR contracts. This you could easily get caught thinking, "Oh, I thought it was this. We didn't spend enough time researching this part."
Hey,
Um,
Christian, I got to interrupt you 1 second. I know the answer, but I think it's an important point to be made. Occasionally, you get a seller who says, I can fix that myself. What's your advice on that one?
yeah, we hear that quite a lot. Per the contract, it just has to be done correctly. So if it's a roof, for example, that would be a really hard thing for a seller to do themselves because it would require a permit, and you can't pull a permit yourself if you're closing within the next year. So an owner permit would not be the right way to go. The county could really put the kibosh on that. You'd also have to build it to building code. So I actually downloaded the Florida building code yesterday. It's online. Um, Good luck to a seller following that with a new roof. If they somehow found a way to do it, there probably isn't a way to stop it. The only thing the buyer could do is make sure that it was done correctly on their walkthrough, have it inspected, make sure that the permit was opened and closed. Probably okay at that point. Dad, do you agree or disagree?
I thought the person, I know the owner can pull a permit generally, but doesn't the work have to be done by a licensed contractor?
I don't think so. I think it just has to be done correctly.
Yeah, I'd have to check.
We haven't gotten to the inspection language. Mike, what do you think of all that issue?
I've always thought it had to be done by a licensed contractor, but
We're gonna look.
We'll
Let's
look.
look at that. Let's see. Yeah, we'll have to look at the inspection language to verify. It's always fun to do this in real time. All right, so the next thing I want to point you to before we get to the real inspection stuff is 188, 189, 190, and 191. This is quite different than NABOR, but it's pretty self-explanatory. Either the seller chooses the closing agent and pays for the owner's title policy, or the buyer does. I think that makes sense. Now, here's my opinion. I think it makes a lot of sense for the buyer to pay for title and the seller to pay for doc stamps. It's a very even way of sharing closing costs because title insurance is generally about $5 per thousand and doc stamps is generally or is $7 per thousand.
Right.
So it's not exactly, but it's pretty darn good where we can say you guys are kind of sharing expenses here. And that title policy is going to benefit the buyer. They're the ones who are going to have a lot of questions about the title, about, what they're getting for their money. And the seller's just paying the fees, they're paying the taxes. We are seeing where sellers are, they're kind of chipping away around the edges and they're saying, well, I'll pay for the title and buyer, you pay for the doc stamp. You'd have to do an amendment or an addendum. You'd have to put some extra language in there. It's a money thing. That's really what it is. And on $1 million deal, we're talking about a $2,000 difference. And I always put it in that perspective when people ask me, hey, why is the seller demanding that we use their company and they'll pay title and we'll pay doc stamps? Say it's money first and foremost. It's all about money. And secondarily, it's about controlling where the closing goes and who they get to work with. Don't ever lose a deal over me. Don't ever do that. Prioritize what your buyer or your seller wants. Get them the best work they can get. Make sure that you're working with people that can find you closing. But, if you can't, if you can do all of that, but it means you don't get to work with me, that's okay. It has to be okay, right? I would be silly to say it otherwise.
Well,
So
and the client can always hire you on top of them anyways.
Say that again?
The client can still hire an attorney above and beyond the closing company chosen by the seller.
Yeah, they could. So if the seller says, I'll pay for title, great. That sounds great. But I'll hire an attorney to double check all the work, that make sure I get all my answers, make sure the contract is right, make sure my title is right. Because if the seller is going to pay the 5 grand, but you only have to pay 1,500 for a buyer attorney, you're doing well. That works as long as we can get comfortable with who the seller is choosing. So do a little bit of due diligence, make sure that they know what they're doing, that it's not their brother that never does closings. As long as it's a legitimate closing firm that does a good job, has a good reputation, I think you're probably going in the right direction. All right, let's keep going. And there is a lot here, but this is how I typically review a contract with an agent one-on-one. So if an agent or a buyer has questions and wants to go over these contracts, we like doing this stuff with you. We're going to kind of skip through some of this stuff. There are things on here.
Paragraph 12.
Here's the important part. What'd you say?
Paragraph 12.
Paragraph 12, inspection. So first, we already talked about the limitations and the mandatory work that the seller would have to do. Now we can talk about the inspection period and more on lean in onto the details behind what these repair items actually are. So first, obviously, you're going to have your date. Interestingly, there's no buyer election time period. So you do everything within your inspection period. Just send it over to the seller. Hey, here's our report. Here's all the things that are wrong. Let us know when they're done. It's really that simple sometimes.
There's no extra 5 days.
There's no extra 5 days. Exactly. Now, if we look at general property inspection and repair, this is where the details of like what's broken and what's not. So line 293, property condition. Following items shall be free of leaks, water damage, or structural damage. Ceiling, roof, exterior, interior walls, doors, windows, foundation. Working condition. That's the term we're looking for. Torn screens, flogged windows, missing roof tiles or shingles shall be repaired or replaced by seller prior to closing. That's different, Dad. Torn screens. That's
Yeah,
not
I
a
always thought
protected
that
item under
was kind
NABOR.
of silly, honestly.
And interestingly, NABOR doesn't actually reference whether fogged windows are a
No.
defect. It doesn't say it. It just
NABOR
says it
has
has to be
torn
watertight
missing
and free.
screens as cosmetic.
Seller is not required to repair or replace cosmetic conditions defined below. Working conditions means operating in the manner in which the item was designed to operate. It's very similar to NABOR. Cosmetic conditions means aesthetic imperfections, but not limited to pitted marcite, which would be in your pool, tears, worn spots, discoloration of floor colorings, wallpaper, similar to NABOR contract.
Right.
Cracked roof tiles, curling, or worn shingles, limited roof life, shall not be considered defects. So, you know what we're not seeing yet? The 4-letter word that we talked about last week. The 4-letter word. General property repairs. Sellers only obligated to make such general repairs as are necessary to bring items into condition specified in 12B2. Seller shall, within 10 days after receipt of buyer's written notice, either have the reports repaired to general repair items completed at seller's expense, or have the repairs estimated by appropriately licensed person. If buyer or seller's inspection reports differ, then they can kind of find a solution there. So it really just talks, Dad, so far, it talks about as necessary to bring items into the conditions specified in paragraph 12B2. So far, it doesn't talk about having a licensed person unless you're kind of countering the buyer's inspection report.
Right.
So far. If cost to repair general item is equal or less than the general repair limit, this is what we talked about. The seller has the right to pay the excess and keep the buyer in the deal, or decline, at which point the buyer can decide, do I move forward anyways, or do I terminate? Now, what's kind of fun is, let's say there were 10 things, and it was $50,000 in repairs. The buyer gets to choose, hey, here's where I want the 15 grand spent. These are the items I want addressed. So far, Dad, I'm not seeing that 4-letter word. Let's keep going. The next one.
You're missing 2 words there, Chris.
Yeah, then the 5 letter word. Yeah, it's 5 letters. Wood destroying organisms is next. And then you have your permits. So, Dad, what's that 4 letter word and what's that 5 letter word?
The 4 letter word is mold and the 5 letter word is radon.
It doesn't say it at all. What's Farby thinking?
There's
So
no
here's
standard
this
really.
is this is probably the big thing that I don't like is if you wanted to use a FAR standard contract, you now have to think about mold and radon. You have to put it back in or advise your client that it's not in there and they'll decide whether that's a big deal for them or not. Mold and radon is not in the FAR standard contract. Mike, what are they doing up there? What are they doing?
Is there a rider that covers that?
Yeah, kind of.
It's kind
There's
of
a
crappy.
rider, but there isn't a radon rider.
Christian, I asked the people who taught this at the real estate certification class why these things were missing, and they looked at me like I was a total idiot. They said, "We're from Pensacola. If we had this in this contract, we would never have a deal close."
That's the
Honest
most
to God,
I've
that's
ever
what I was
heard.
told.
And you said, well, we're in Naples and we use it on every deal.
I know, but I was stunned. I mean, they thought I was a total idiot.
Yeah, I think that is the wrong approach to this business. Um, our job is not just to close. Remember, it's the three-headed monster. It's get it under contract, protect your customer, and close. You have to do all three. If you got it under contract and closed, but the buyer got really destroyed in the meantime, you're going to be a one-hit wonder. You're just not going to have more closings, not with that buyer or anyone else. It's not the way we do business. Um, it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay for things to fall through the cracks, but purposely misleading your customer or not protecting them because you fear a deal would never close, let's do something else. Let's do something else. People are going to disagree with me, but I feel pretty strongly that once you get up to this point, maybe you were okay with the 1.5%. Maybe you're okay with adding the washer and dryer and the damages clause that we haven't gone over in depth. You're like, all right, I can get through this. I can get through this. And then you're like, wait, I have to add a mold rider, and then I have to create a radon rider. Oh my gosh, what are we doing?
Well, and have you seen, question for you, Chris? I mean, you practiced in Georgia for a long time. What did you guys do with mold in Georgia? Did you have a language like we have in Nabor?
No, because we used as is contracts.
Yeah.
So if the buyer wanted to do a mold test, like we did for our house, then we would get a mold test. And if it
Yeah.
came up that it was positive for mold or needed to be addressed, then we would ask the seller to address it. We would negotiate a credit or we would negotiate remediation. Dad, the beautiful house we owned up in Marietta, there
Right.
was there was some penicillin aspergillus.
Right. Remember it.
Yeah, we made an amendment with the seller. Actually, what we did is I shared the report with the seller and said, "Hey, we're going to do some research. Let's figure out a solution here." And he said, "Yeah, let's figure out." We ended up both calling the same company, and so we're like, "All right, we're moving in the right direction together." And then when we got our quote, the seller said, "Yep, I'll do that. That's fine." And basically, we had the air conditioning replaced because it wasn't running. And then we had the upstairs totally remediated, removed all the carpets, and got a clean slate. So we fixed the issue, and then we cleaned and sanitized the space.
You
And
added
the seller was
ductwork and you used UVA lights as well.
and then we went a little above and beyond. We used UVA lights and we had new filters and all that good stuff. So, um, you know, as is great. Scott mentions most realtors in Lee County use the as is contract. You beat me to it, Scott. I agree. This is where most people are going with it. I think the as is such an easier contract, especially if you are not used to FAR. If you don't have these built-in forms available to you, if you haven't done the research, or if you don't want to do the extra work, the as is the simplest way to go up to this point, right?
Much
It's
safer
just,
for the realtor.
we're going to keep going here. because the next part that I think is quite different than NABOR is the default language or the remedies clauses. We're going to actually read them. That's how different they are. So first, we're going to go to B, line 436, seller default. So this is if the seller fails to close. So if they go into default, if for any reason other than the failure of seller to make seller's title marketable, so we'll kind of take that off the board, uh, seller fails, neglects, or refuses to perform seller's obligations under the contract, buyer may elect to receive or return the buyer's deposit without thereby waiving any action for damages resulting from seller's breach, and pursuant to paragraph 16, may seek to recover such damages or seek specific performance. Basically, the buyer can do whatever they need to. They can get their deposit back, they can sue for damages, they can sue for specific performance. Very similar to NABOR, very similar. Buyer default, very different from NABOR. And this is where you could put your buyer in a little bit of hot water if you're not advising them correctly. Or if they think, oh, well, we did a mold test and it's super high and we need the seller to fix it. And then you realize we didn't do a mold addendum. And then you realize not only would the buyer lose their deposit, they could be sued for more. It's actually quite extreme. If buyer fails, neglects, or refuses to perform buyer's obligations under the contract, including payment of the deposit within the time specified, seller may elect to recover and retain the deposit for the account of seller as agreed upon liquidated damages. That's number one. Or line 434, seller at seller's option may, pursuant to paragraph 16, proceed in equity to enforce seller's rights under this contract. Dad, what does that mean?
There's a whole bunch of cases out there. The court has discretion under certain situations to do things above and beyond, writing a check from the buyer.
Well, they can sue, right? Isn't that what that means?
Yeah, it's discretionary. I mean, I must say, I don't think I've ever seen a court grant the seller equitable relief in a situation like this. But you can, in law school, they can come up with them.
Well, it is very different than NABOR. NABOR says that they can only take the deposit made,
Period.
Liquidated damages. So
That's it.
I can confidently tell the buyer that the most they would lose is the deposit that they already made. That first deposit, hopefully not, but maybe the second deposit if they already made it.
I
I
mean, they
can't
might,
say that to a buyer in a FAR contract.
in some rare situations, theoretically, they could go for consequential damages, if the seller relied on promises made by the buyer. But I have
think
never
it's
seen that.
realistic that a seller who's in a bad spot that doesn't have a lot of other options would sue you or at least threaten or hire an attorney or file something. And the buyer would have, they would have their work cut out for them. I would say this is tough. And if they got to that point because you didn't help them enough in getting a mold addendum or a radon addendum or whatever else, or you didn't
Yeah.
explain the 1.5% correctly, it could be a real challenge.
Well, and the thing with equity is it's totally discretionary with the judge. And if you're going to ask for equity, if you're the seller, you have to have behaved perfectly. To get
Yeah.
equity, you have to, act accordingly. You have to
My
be
name
a
is
good guy.
Christian, which means follower of Christ. It doesn't mean I'm Christ, right? I make mistakes all the time. Uh, this is a tough contract for that. Tough contract. Dad, what is line 523? Time is of the essence. That's another
Now,
big
that's a biggie. Time is of the essence for everything in this
for
contract.
everything. I
I
just
like it. I like
just
that.
had a contract cancel where the buyer kept coming up with excuses as to why they hadn't made their deposit. It was, oh, well, the funds haven't cleared the brokerage account. Oh, I need an extra day. Oh, there's a delay down at the bank. Any one of those 1 day delays could have allowed the seller to terminate and sue for the deposits. That's a tough one. That's tough. So it's very, hard line. Time matters. Time matters. And good things, the contract timing otherwise still works just like NABOR. If a deadline falls on a weekend or holiday, it rolls to the next business day, just like NABOR. It's got prorations, it's got risk of loss if there was a hurricane or storm. It's got some built-in 1031 language. Everything else is pretty darn similar. In fact, even the checkboxes are very similar. You know, when one big difference is how the condo rider and the homeowner association rider work. There is no homeowner association addendum with NABOR. There's just a disclosure. But the homeowner association rider with FARBAR actually has a lot more information. It has fees and you know other disclosures that are in it. So that would have to be checked. You'd have to check your homeowner disclosure. You could, after getting through all this, do the last thing, do what I might suggest. So K, it's the as-is addendum or as-is rider. I'm going to give you an option. It's not my favorite. I'm not thrilled with this option, but I see its value. Let's say the seller put on the listing that they want a standard contract. And this is NABOR or FARBAR. This works for both. So they put on there that they want a standard contract, and you're like, man, I really want the as-is. Christian can't shut up about it. But I don't want to do all that work just for the seller or the listing agent to say, I don't want it. I wanted the as-is, or I wanted the standard. So here's the option. Do a standard, do the FARBAR standard, and include the as-is rider, which allows the buyer the right to terminate for any reason in their sole discretion. And that way, if the listing agent comes back and says, we won't agree to this is a deal breaker, yada, 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 well, you could just remove it. You can take it out, and then you don't have to do the work again. You've got your standard. You already have it. And then your buyer will know, all right, you really were fighting for me. You were trying to get the as-is. We're trying to give us the most ability to get out of the deal if need be, or renegotiate or ask for credits. So I've seen that. I think it works. The only downside I see is it's a little confusing. It's confusing to have this addendum and the inspection clause. Yeah, Yvette mentions, plus the buyer only needs to read one contract. I think that's a value add. I really do. So I do think that's a good policy to have. It's a good process. Always do a standard contract, but include the as-is addendum. I'm going to keep trying to do as-is contracts. I think without the addendum is better. It's one extra page I don't want.
You
I don't
mentioned earlier, somebody mentioned earlier that most contracts up in Lee County are as is.
Yeah.
That is by far safer for the agents. Just be careful with the finance clause. Time is of the essence for everything. Add your washer dryer. But if you miss one of these things, you have your as is period to correct them.
Yeah. Mike, what do you think? How'd I do?
I learned a lot. No, very informative. I mean, you reinforced some of my thinking, and I learned some new things too. So thank you, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for watching. I took a little longer. This is time consuming. I think the big theme here is be careful. The as is simpler because you can jump between contracts a lot simpler, a lot easier if you're using as is. But the standard, if you're forced to use it, don't be afraid. Use the mold addendum. Let me help you create a radon addendum, or use the as-is rider. You know, any of those would work. So I wish you luck. Thank you both for helping me out, and call us if you need us.